So from the 2nd century until the second half of the 20th century, the Jewish people continued to be a minority in what they still continue to consider their homeland. And for the most part, you know that, we've been living in a growing worldwide diaspora, which in Jewish tradition has always been referred to as the Galut. In Ashkenazi pronunciation is Golus, but the correct Hebrew pronunciation is Galut, meaning the exile, not diaspora. And in the 2,000 years from the 2nd century to the 20th century, to the middle of the 20th century, Jewish people have been completely dependent basically on the whims of various rulers in the various land where they want, and also in the homeland. The time between the mid-19th and the mid-20th centuries marks basically, well, we all know the history, the most tragic era in Jewish history. And, you know, from the Russian pogroms culminating in the Holocaust. And the majority of the Jews in the modern world today are where they are directly, or some indirectly, but as a result of those tragic events. Which is why in the 20th century, the vast majority of the Jewish people live in Israel and in the United States, in that order. Before we move forward, let's look at some of the events that we covered in previous Jewish history courses. In the previous we covered the European Enlightenment, if you remember, of the mid-17th century, that began with Baruch Spinoza. And by the end of the 18th century, it created the Jewish Enlightenment, the Haskalah movement. Officially, the name of officially it's named Haskalah, meaning enlightenment in Hebrew, basically. We noted before that the Haskalah movement had two major aims. The first was really considered the most important by the Maskilim, the members of the Haskalah movement, spreading secular education among the Jews. Now, the Jewish academies, traditionally, their study, going all the way back to the Talmud, included secular studies. One of the major Talmudic rabbis referred to himself as the paths of the sky, of the heavens, are known to me as well as the street of Nehal De'ah, the name of his city. Okay? In other words, he was an astronomer, not only a rabbi. Okay. The Maskilim assumed that that would lead to, spreading secular education would lead to their second major aim, which is Jewish emancipation. Because throughout Europe at that point, Jews were considered and considered themselves as a nation, not simply a religion. We were never even in the Jewish religion, we are not referred to as the Jewish members of the Jewish religion, but Am Yisrael, the nation of Israel, wherever we were. So, although the Haskalah began in Western Europe, it had to quickly spread to where most of the Jews were, to Eastern Europe. So until World War II, that was where the vast majority of Europe's Jews, in fact, the majority of the world's Jews lived. So here is the way it was at the end of the 19th century. In Eastern Europe, predominantly the Russian Empire. Now, Romania was not part of the Russian Empire, neither was Bulgaria, but the vast majority were under the Russian Tsar, and in any case, in Eastern Europe, there were, out of 11 million Jews worldwide, 7 million lived in Eastern Europe. 2 million lived in Central and Western Europe. 1.5 million in the United States and Canada. And in the rest of the world, under 1 million. Okay? So about 16. Yeah.
So the Ottoman Empire during that period,
right,
at the end of the 19th century, may have included Bulgaria, right?
No.
No, not then?
Oh, it included definitely part of it, yes,
Okay.
yes.
So
That's
in
right.
the Ottoman Empire,
And it included all of what we used to call Yugoslavia, yeah.
in the Ottoman Empire, what were the number of Jews?
Well, that takes Jews both from the East and, the East, I meant Asia and Eastern Europe, but I couldn't answer that. I'm not sure. But most of what we think of as Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews did live in the Ottoman Empire. But in any case, in the Russian Empire, where about 60% of the world Jewry, let me just finish this, yeah. In the Russian Empire, they were highly persecuted. Jews were highly persecuted. I'll get a little more into that because that's important in the development of Zionism. In the Islamic world, the Jews lived in relative safety. In fact, probably better than anywhere in Europe proper, but in the Islamic world, they were officially considered, the Arabic word is dhimmi, which was used also by the Turks. It means protected people. In other words, officially they were citizens of sorts, but definitely second-class citizens. And in North America and Western Europe, officially Jews were fully emancipated by the end of the 19th century, but there was growing anti-Semitism that came with that emancipation. So, in other words, the Jews were kind of okay when they lived in ghettos. When they started becoming part of the major population, well, later we'll talk about the Dreyfus trial and such and other events of the same era. So, the Jewish reform movement in Germany, one of the ancestors of our movement, aimed at Jewish assimilation. Okay, it was the first Jewish movement to officially declare that the Jews are no longer a nationality. So they are the first group that openly demanded that Jews become full citizens and recognize themselves as, well, in Germany where it started, Germans of the Jewish faith, or what they call the Jewish persuasion. Okay, so the assimilationists were an important part of the Haskalah movement, a later part of the Haskalah movement. Okay, so and at first they dominated in Eastern Europe as well. As the idea came to Eastern Europe, they accepted it with the idea of assimilation. but most of the Jews in Eastern Europe lived under the Tsar, the rule of the Russian Tsar, Jews resided there. They've always been living there under extreme repression. Okay. That started basically in the 17th century with the creation of the Russian Empire. The Russian basically took over Ukraine, vast parts of Poland, all of Lithuania, so those were those areas were an important part of the Pale of Settlements, the only area where Jews were allowed to live under. So the Russian Empire inherited what were before the Jews of Poland and Lithuania, that included Ukraine initially, and that was, let's say, both sides were not very happy with that, with most Jews suddenly being part of the Russian Empire. In any case, by the middle of the 19th century, there was a growing political opposition by various nationalities within the Russian Empire. The Russians considered the largest nationality, but it included Poland, Ukraine, many Asian countries. And there was a growing political opposition to the government, and they demanded basically a democratization, and beginning with the ending of the feudal system, which they lived under. The Russian Empire was the last feudal government in Europe. So at the same time, the various non-Russian nationalities in the empire were demanding either equity or outright independence from the Russians. In response, the Russian authorities attempted to shift the blame for the extreme poverty of the majority of the Russian population to the Jews. In 1871, a series of government-sponsored pogrom began. And now I have to mention something. I was supposed to get, oh Lord, I gave Anne-Marie those, I wanted to give you the handout of this, but in any case, there was, at that period, in 1871 actually, the Russian secret police published what they referred to as the protocols of the meetings of the learned elders of Zion. You're all familiar with it. I wanted to give you copies of the cover of that. But the cover of that I had in my copy was the almost immediate publication of those in English. In London, followed by in English also in the United States, and those were the copies that were spread by Henry Ford.
Can you repeat the title of that again, please?
I'm sorry?
Can you repeat the title of that again?
Well, we just refer to it as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. They refer to it as the Protocols of the Meetings of the Learned Elders of Zion.
Thank you.
Now, those government-sponsored pogroms continued for 10 years until 1881. Okay, began in 71 and continued till 81, so full 10 years, and then it got much worse. Yeah.
A synopsis of what the protocols were?
I'm sorry?
What was it, the protocols?
Protocols.
The protocols.
Just a
It's basically later I'll read you some of it, but it was a supposed protocols that they got of a meeting of the international headquarters of the Jews, which didn't exist. Those were the learned elders of Zion, okay? So basically it was a forgery of something that didn't even, of a meeting that didn't exist, of an organization that didn't exist.
This meeting is the meeting where the Jews can control the world.
Where they conspire to control the world.
Guys,
Yeah.
I think that is still published in Saudi Arabia.
It had been published in Saudi Arabia, in Egypt, in the Palestinian territories fairly recently. So-
Question.
Yeah,
So, I want to go back a little bit. The difference between Jews in the Ottoman Empire, in the Muslim Empire, conditions of Jews there, compared to in what I would call the Christian Empire.
sure.
And you haven't mentioned the church, Christian church at all, but I always felt that the reason, the initial reason of the anti-Semitism in the Christian world is that we killed Christ. So every single week,
Yeah,
people are going to church and they're very religious in the East, especially Poland, and they're listening to these sermons, which every single week,
Sure.
Jesus is killed by whom? Well, the Jews.
yeah. Until Vatican II.
Right, and it's still, of course, some people have ignored Vatican II in Eastern Europe today. So, to me, that's a huge component in terms of understanding the source of anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
The Protocol of Zion do come along, but the population, it's already been brainwashed to this day.
Correct. Basically, what we think of as anti-Semitism began under is a very late. Very often we read of some Greek philosophers, mostly in Egypt, in Hellenistic Egypt, being against Jews, but or Romans being against Jews. We refer to it as anti-Semitism, but that's not what it was. They were against, for example, the Greek population, they refer to themselves as Greek, but the Hellenistic population of the Mediterranean area, to them, the Jews were, the Jewish nation was basically a competitor, and it was a squabble between different nationalities. With Emperor Theodosius, the first Christian emperor of Rome, of the Roman Empire, that's the beginning of the church's official stand on the Jews being the cause for whatever the opposition of everything Christianity came from. And that's the beginning of anti-Semitism as we know it. Where every Jew is responsible. And that's where I forgot in which gospel it specifically, but that Jews took on themselves, they weren't given that, they took on themselves the responsibility of killing the Jews, and they declared, the high priest declared, be it on us and on our descendants. That's the beginning of anti-Semitism. That's, that also never happened, but that's the start of the beginning of anti-Semitism. Odessa, the city of Odessa in Ukraine, was the center of the Haskalah movement in the Russian Empire. it was where secular Jews felt more at peace than anywhere else in the Russian Empire. So it was for that reason that in 1871, the first government-instigated pogrom began in Odessa, where Jews thought they were fairly secure. One of the leaders of the Haskalah movement in the Russian Empire, who at that point also resided, he was originally from Warsaw, I believe, but he resided in Odessa. Remember, both of them were part of the Russian Empire. So, it was a physician named Leon Pinsker, okay? In Yiddish, it wouldn't be Leon, it was Label. In Russian, it's Lev, but in English, it's Leon. Okay, so Pinsker was born in 1821 in Poland, but as an adult, he lived and practiced medicine in Odessa. Originally, Dr. Pinsker was a strong ideological believer in assimilation. Just to stop for a second, if I asked you who was the founder of Zionism, assuming you think you know the answer, how many of you would say Herzl? Okay, not true. Herzl is very important. He made it he took the original present Zionist movement, which began in Eastern Europe, not in the West, and turned it into an active political movement. So Dr. Pinsker was an ideological believer in assimilation. So he was not initially anything like a Zionist. Even following the 1871 Odessa pogrom, and he was practicing medicine in Odessa at the time, he actually announced that eventually, if the Jews would only continue to demonstrate that they are useful, contributing citizens, they would be eventually accepted as such. So basically, they would get their rights, they would be emancipated eventually by showing the will.
Is that what you meant by the word auto-emancipation?
I'll get to that. No, it's not. Okay, so, but a series of events that began in 1881 would convince even the ideologically assimilationist Pinsker that the Jews would never get equal rights in the Russian Empire. Or anywhere else in modern Europe, for that matter. So let's review those events, which eventually culminated, well, let's just look at the events. The Russian Empire was, as I said, the last feudal country in Europe. But in 1861, as part of an attempt to modernize his empire, the new Tsar, Alexander II, initiated a series of reforms. And the first of them was an emancipation decree, emancipating the serfs. Okay, so the majority of Russian farmers, I should say peasants, were serfs. Were still serfs. Excuse me. Now, the Russian people, in reality, all the Russian nationalities in the Russian Empire were very hungry for reforms. And they were very happy. They started out being elated by the reforms that were offered by the Tsar. But the problem was that those reforms didn't accomplish a whole lot. The plots of land that the peasants were given, since they are now free, the areas, the land that they were working, which were part of the large lands of parts of the lands of the nobility, the plots that they were working were actually not the plots that they were given, which were much smaller than the plots that they could work as serfs. And then, at the same time, the Tsar's decree demanded that they pay for the land. Now, since they were poor peasants, they could take up to 49 years to pay, to make continuing payments for the land. However, there was no way that the impoverished, they had no money, that the impoverished peasants could possibly make those payments. It always reminded me of how many people remember the 40 acres and a mule. Kind of the same thing. What the Russian middle class wanted was the same democratic rights that were enjoyed in Western Europe. And that especially included an elected parliament. They didn't ask for a republic under the Tsar. But the Tsar vehemently opposed any idea, any form of an elected parliament, or Duma in Russian. His reforms, therefore, ended up bringing more disappointment than satisfaction in Russia. And as for the Jews of Russia, they also hoped that with the beginning of the reforms, their civil rights would also come. But that was, by the way, what the Maskilim of Odessa, that was what the assimilationists were hoping for, including Pinsker. But on the whole, the 1870s brought more disappointment and more troubles. As I said, that's when the pogroms began. And as a result, many young Jews ended up in the more radical wings of the Russian reform movements. Yeah.
Can you define assimilation, and would we be considered assimilationists?
Assimilation to them was very, there's a lot more to it, but it began with the Jews being full citizens, assimilated in wherever. So as I said, the assimilationists in Germany officially declared the Jews henceforth are no longer a nation. They are a religious. So a German Jew is a German, as I said, of the Jewish religion. But he's a German first. That was where now in Russia they couldn't do that. In Russia they were very much considered a nationality. To date, by the way.
Now, did the rabbis of the time go along with this?
I said that was the Maskilim. The rabbis were very opposed to the Enlightenment movement. But I'm not getting into that because that doesn't have to do with our specific subject. But no, the rabbis were very much opposed to that.
Hungarians too.
But I'm talking about secular Jews. So, yeah.
Hungarians too were very
Yeah.
nationalistic.
So, a lot of the areas that you think where the Jews are considered Hungarian Jews were at that time part of the Russian Empire or part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which Hungary at large was, one of the two major nationalities. So, one of those radical movements that I mentioned was a very, very small group of Russian students who called their little movement Narodnaya Valya. I put that on the board, meaning basically the people's will. That organization decided that real reform would only come if they assassinate every important leader, important parts of the nobility of their empire, who ran things, including the Tsar, of course.
Wow.
Okay, well that was the idea. And they immediately began a series of attempts on the Russian Tsar. Of course, they were very inept. They were a small group of students. They didn't manage to do much except getting themselves arrested and executed until in March of 1881, when the Tsar's carriage rode through the streets of St. Petersburg, a group, 4 members of Narodnaya Valya, threw a bomb into the carriage and succeeded in assassinating Alexander II. Okay, I had to mention, because that becomes very important part in the growing anti-Semitism, growing attacks on Jews, but not even one of the members of Narodnaya Valya was Jewish. It was a very small Russian organization.
Lenin's brother was in it.
I'm sorry?
Lenin's brother was in it.
Right, that's right. They refer to him as the Narodniki. Right. So, one of the assassins was a Russian man named Gessia Gelfman. Now, Gelfman, you notice, is a German name. It's not a Russian name. A lot of Russians had German names because there were a lot of German nationals were part of the Russian Empire, and there was cross marriages. Now, Gelfman was an atheist, but he was christened at birth as Russian Orthodox. But because he had that German surname, it helped the Russian secret police in blaming the Jews. Again, shifting the blame for the Jews. Well, the reforms didn't work. Look at who is causing it. Look at who's causing your problems. So, as a result of actively blaming the Jews, spreading copies of the protocols, and they inspired retaliatory in quotes, because the Jews didn't participate in an assassination, but retaliatory attacks by Christians on Jewish communities throughout the empire, throughout the Jewish Pale of Settlement where the Jews lived. Needless to say, those attacks were encouraged by the authorities, and following the Tsar's assassination, from March 1881 to the end of the year, so just in that 2/3 of a year alone, thousands of Jewish homes were destroyed. Large numbers of men, women, and children were injured and killed. 166 Jewish communities, towns where where there was a Jewish community, in the southwestern part of the empire were destroyed. Now, the first large pogrom began on the night of Orthodox Easter in 1881. Easter is the obvious, you know. In a Ukrainian city that was called at that time Elizabethgrad. Today in Ukraine it's called Kirovograd. Christian business owners in the city used the anti-Jewish atmosphere to basically get rid of their Jewish competitors, to destroy their businesses. And the ongoing pogroms now put an end to any attempt of Jewish assimilation. It not only looked impossible, it became impossible. Now, the pogroms that began in 1881 kind of dissipated toward the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, but under Tsar Nikolai II, the Tsar of the Russian Revolution, right? Following the failed revolution in 1905, everybody, I assume, knows that the first Russian Revolution was not the 1917, the February Revolution, but the 1905 attempt at revolution. So, throughout those pogroms, the police and the army, at best, stood by during attacks on Jews, but often they actually participated. And they encouraged them and helped them. I want to give you a quote here. This is from the journal of, at that point, during 1905, a functionary of the Bolshevik wing of the Russian Social Democratic Party. It was before there was a Communist Party, okay? He was named Osip Piatinsky, and he was politically active in Odessa during the 1905 revolution. So, here's what he wrote in his journal. Starting in the beginning of a sentence. There I saw the following scene. A gang of young men between 20 and 25 years old, among whom there were very obvious plainclothes policemen and members of the Okhrana. The Okhrana was the Russian secret police. Were rounding up anyone who looked like a Jew, men, women, or children, which means basically Jews who were dressed like Orthodox Jews, were very obvious Jews, stripped them naked and beat them mercilessly. The socialist participants in the 1905 revolution, we immediately organized a group of revolutionaries armed with revolvers. That was the only weapon they had at the time. We ran up to them and fired at them. They ran away. But suddenly, between us and the pogromists, there appeared a stilled wall of soldiers, armed to the teeth and facing us. When we retreated, the soldiers went away, and the pogromists came out again. This happened several times, and it became clear that the pogromists were acting together with the military. Leon Pinsker had been one of the first Jews to be accepted into Odessa University. But while he was still a student, he founded a Jewish organization that stressed the need for Russian education for Jews. although he initially completed his studies in law. His first degree was in law. He realized that being a Jew, he would never be able to become a lawyer. There was a very strict government quota on all Jewish professionals, and the only profession was fairly open was medicine. So he therefore changed the course of his studies and became a physician. Despite the disappointment, he continued to believe that the Jewish problem would be resolved once the Jews gained equal rights, and that will come. Even living through the 1871 Odessa pogrom, he did not dissuade him from continuing to basically write that Jews in Russia need to prove their loyalty to the homeland. And as they do, such incidents would come to an end. But the large wave of pogrom that began with the assassination of the Tsar throughout the Pale brought about a radical change in his views. Following a visit to Germany, Pinsker wrote his famous pamphlet, Auto-Emancipation. That pamphlet addressed to the Jews of the Russian Empire was subtitled, An Appeal to His Fellow People from a Russian Jew. Anne-Marie was going to make me copies of the two handouts that I had, and that was one of them. But I guess I'll give it next week. We don't have a copier as of now. So, in any case, since Russian censorship would never allow his pamphlet to be printed, he printed it in German. And in it, he urged his fellow Jews to strive for something he would never have done before as an assimilation. We need to strive for a Jewish national consciousness. As expected, the pamphlet raised a huge response, both pro and con, of course. The results of that pamphlet, the almost immediate results of that pamphlet, marked 1881 as the beginning of the practical Zionist movement. I emphasize practical Zionist movement rather than political Zionist movement. The credit for that does belong to Herzl. So, as a physician, Pinsker analyzed and diagnosed the ancient hatred of Jews, and he never refused the term anti-Semitism. He used a clinical term, Judeophobia. Pinsker knew that the combination of mutually exclusive assertions is a characteristic of psychological disorder, and he was convinced that psychological irrational phobia is the cause of anti-Semitism. This is how he explained that in actuality the hatred of the Jews in his milieu. He said, to the living, the Jew is a corpse. To the native, he's a foreigner. To the homesteader, he's a vagrant. To the proprietary, he is a beggar. To the poor, an exploiter. To the patriot, a man without a country. And for all, he is a hated rival. And it was basically a fact of life in the Russian Empire. Okay. His study of the roots of this ancient hatred led him first to call for the establishment of a Jewish national national homeland anywhere in the world. And there were other attempts at that time. There was the attempt of a French Jew, the Baron Hirsch, to found colonies in Jewish colonies in Argentina, for example. They still exist, by the way. They are referred to as the Jewish gauchos. There aren't that many of them. But under the influence of Jewish writer Moses Mendelbaum, Pinsker came to agree with him that hatred of Jews was rooted in the fact that no matter where Jews live, Jews would still be a foreigner anywhere except in their original homeland, the land of Israel. And that was the only place that a large number of Jews would be willing to do it. Now, never in the pamphlet is there a mention of a Jewish state. Later on, following Herzl, one of the major leaders of Zionism following Herzl, Ahad Ha'am, did not want to found a Jewish state. He wanted to found a place, a headquarters for the Jewish people, a center for the Jewish people in Palestine. Eventually, in late 1881, people founded and became the first chairman of an organization called Chovevei Zion, Lovers of Zion, and that was the first practical Zionist movement. Between 1881 and the outbreak of World War I, 2 million people, for obvious reasons that we discussed, left the Russian Empire due to the Russian pogroms. So, of the 7 million, 2 million had left during those pogroms. The majority of them emigrated to the United States. But some formed the first Aliyah. So the first movement of Jews to Palestine, beginning, as I said, with Chovevei Zion.
NATAN,
Yes.
out of curiosity, I'd really like to know how many people at this table have this history in their families, that they left from Eastern Europe.
Oh.
Anybody
No,
here?
I do.
Everybody.
Wow,
This
good
is
question.
Yeah.
Yes.
My father
The
came to
remnant.
Palestine.
I'm so
My father came to Palestine in 1930. Between 28 and 30.
It's incredible.
You know, so.
Thank you.
Good question.
It wasn't a question, it was just.
So in any case, but I think just about all of you,
A European.
definitely most of you, came to the United States during and following those events.
Yeah, incredible.
So, now, founding any organization in the Russian Empire, you needed government approval. But it came as no surprise that Pinsker easily secured approval for an organization dedicated to emigration of Jews out of the Russian Empire. The government had no problem with that, which he called Society for the Support of Jewish Farmers and Artisans in Palestine. As a charity, it was founded as a charity organization dedicated to the practical aspects, but it was in reality dedicated to practical aspects of beginning a migration to Palestine.
So Nathan,
Yeah.
that becomes, if it's a charity, it also becomes the basis for funding for the first Aliyah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That totally, you know. It was initially, actually he founded within his movement something called the Odessa Committee, you know, which was basically the fundraiser, but also the supplier of means to the people moving to Palestine. In 1882, a group of Chobevei Zion found the first modern Zionist settlement in the land of Israel, Rishon LeZion, known as also the first, known as the home of the first winery in Palestine. And following the authors, this is, I want to give you the preface that Pinsker, and I'll end with this for the history, but this is the preface to his pamphlet. After the terror of the bloody atrocities, a moment of calm followed for both the baiter and the baited to catch their breath. Meanwhile, the Jewish refugees, with the very funds collected for their immigration, are being repatriated. Repatriated, it doesn't mean by the government, it's called by various Jewish agencies. Shut your eyes and hide your head like an ostrich. That's what he calls the people that are repatriating them to other parts of the Pale, basically. There is to be no lasting peace unless these fleeting intervals of relaxation between pogroms, you know, you apply a remedy more thoroughgoing than those palliatives to which our hapless people have been turning for 2,000 years. In other words, moving from one plan to another when things become impossible. Okay, so,
Hey, Don,
yes.
how many Palestinian